wasn't so long ago now that views like this one were absolutely commonplace. And that's the view of a public service commissioner in 1920, Mr. McLaughlin, when he was looking at whether or not we needed women in the public service. See, the problem with women is that they reach their limit of usefulness at a comparatively young age. Now, if you think that views change very quickly, can you fast forward about 40 years? And this is taken directly from a board minute which looked at whether or not we should have female trade commissioners. See, it's much easier to find difficulties with women, some of which spring to mind are a spinster lady can, and very often does, turn into a battle axe with the passing years, whereas a man usually matures and mellows. Now, if you're sitting there thinking, oh, well, thank goodness no one thinks like that anymore, I have to tell you that yes, we have advanced. There's no question about that. Community attitudes have advanced. I still meet a few people who think like that, but I have to say that most of the views and attitudes that anchor us to a model that no longer serves us well are seen in the unseen places, in the private conversations, the conversations that happen around the boardroom table, or with groups of parliamentarians, or in the sporting club, or indeed in our very own families. About 30 years ago now, Australia had the vision to be one of a very few countries that established a body for the protection and promotion of human rights. And as part of that, Australia established the role of Sex Discrimination Commissioner. That was someone with a statutory mandate to pursue gender equality in all aspects of Australian life. It's a role that takes you from 200 metres under the ocean in a submarine to the United Nations in New York, to working with acid survivors in Bangladesh, to camping out with Indigenous women in remote Australia, to the World Bank, the Pentagon, the White House, and everywhere in between. And that's really the tremendous privilege of my role, that I get to work every day with individuals, women and men, who are creating significant change in their own spheres of influence, who are helping drive a more equal Australia. I've been in my role 6 years now, and I'm becoming more and more convinced about one thing. And that is that if we want to deliver equality for women, we actually have to focus on men. We have to focus on men. And that became clear to me as I've been in the role. What I think we've understood for some time is that gender equality can't occur without the commitment of men. But what we haven't recognised so well is, what does it take to move men from being interested in it to action? And that's what I want to chat with you today, discuss with you today about. I want to look at what it takes in the military environment and also in the corporate world. And I'd suggest to you that if we want to move men from interest to action, we have to engage the head and the heart. Now, if you can imagine for a minute a world in which your most private conversations are spread far and wide, they become public, where your most intimate secrets are spread across the globe. We're actually already in that connected world, a world which is full of sexual imagery and words, a world where we can transmit those words at the push of a button. And sadly, that sometimes happens without the consent of those involved. And that's the world that I was drawn into back in April 2011, when an incident occurred in Australia's Defence Force Academy, our tri-service military academy, which is called the Skype incident. Some of you may be aware of that incident. It involved a male and female cadet having consensual sex. What she didn't appreciate was that that was being broadcast live via Skype to a number of men in a room nearby. And as the story broke on Australian TV, The community outrage was absolutely palpable. Was this just a question of university students behaving badly? Or was it something more sinister than that? Was it the sexualisation and marginalisation of women in Australia's military? And that was the world into which I was drawn when the Minister for Defence asked me if I would head a review into the treatment of women in Australia's military. Our review has been extensive. I've travelled to 60 military bases, travelled underwater in submarines, above water in warships and frigates, been in tanks and armoured vehicles, up in Black Hawk helicopters, tactical response helicopters, C-130s and other fixed-wing aircraft. And we've been out beyond the wire in the forward operating bases, as you can see here, in the mountains and valleys of Oruzgan province in Afghanistan. And I've spoken to thousands of Defence Force personnel. And as I travelled around Australia and beyond, one of the things that happened was that people wanted to tell me their stories. Many of the stories were stories that were absolutely positive. They were stories about how the Australian Defence Force had served its members very, very well. But I have to say, on occasion, there were deeply distressing stories, stories which had never been told before. And that's when it occurred to me, yes, it was important that I heard those stories so that I could put them into the report. But what was more important was that those men that had the power to create change in the system heard the stories, that they both heard and also felt the case for change. So armed with this intent, I flew in women from all over the country. Many of them elected to bring their mothers, so that those chiefs, the chief of each of a service, could sit down and hear what extreme exclusion feels like, what it's like to be on exercise when no one talks to you for 4 months, what it's like to be sexually assaulted by your instructor, the very person that you trust and go to for advice, what it's like to have your career trashed and your peer group ostracise you, all because you had the courage to speak out. And I brought in the chiefs of each of the service, and I wondered, would this strategy work? Because military and emotion are not necessarily words that sit easily side by side. And I still remember the first session, the service chief sitting uncomfortably in his chair, the mother nervously escorting her daughter to the chair beside, a box of tissues in the middle. But how to get this conversation going? And it was that young woman, she looked at the chief and she said, "Sir, I am so very nervous." And he turned to her and he said, "Believe me, I'm scared too." And in that minute, I knew we had a chance at change, because it takes an authentic and compassionate military leader to admit that he's fearful about what he's about to hear. And the chiefs heard the pain of mothers who had encouraged their daughters into the service, mothers who believed that the enemy lay outside, not within. As one mother said, she looked directly into the eyes of a chief and she said, "Sir, I gave you the person I love most in the world, and this is how you've treated her." And at the end of those sessions, to hear the chief, the service chiefs, say, "What happened to you should never have happened. If I could stand in your shoes every day and take away your pain, I would choose to do that. I am so deeply sorry. I will do everything in my power to make sure that never happens again." And when I see the military chiefs out now, I know that sitting behind that, their advocacy and their action, is that deep resolve It taught me that even in the most traditional and conservative organisations, when we engage both the head and the heart, that's when transformational change happens. But it's actually quite easy to look at the military and point the finger and say, well, they're the views that are only held in the military. I'm here to tell you today that that's absolutely not the case. The views, the attitudes, the beliefs I see every day in Australia's military are held much more broadly across the Australian community. And they're held in our families, in male-dominated industries, in our parliament, in a whole range of other places. They're also held in corporate Australia. You see, when I came into my role, I believed that it was women working with women that was going to create change in Australia. And I still believe that. I still believe that actually where we've got today is largely on a change that's been brought about on the back of women's activism. But when you think about it, the fact is to rely solely on women to change the practices and the structures that maintain the status quo is an absolutely illogical approach when you recognise the site of organisational power. Here in Australia, as in most countries, organisational power resides in the hands of men. So if we want to see change, we need to work with men to bring that change. And that's why about 3 years ago now, I set up what at the time was quite a controversial strategy called the Male Champions of Change strategy, a strategy that once again focused on men. How did it begin? Well, basically, I picked up the phone and I rang many of the men that you're seeing here on the screen. I rang the CEOs of iconic Australian companies like Qantas, like Telstra, like Woolworths, like the ANZ. I rang the CEOs of the local CEOs of big global brands like Citibank, like Goldman Sachs, like Deloitte. I rang the heads of big government departments like the Treasury, like the Prime Minister and Cabinet's Department and the Chief of the Army. And I made a personal plea. I said, will you use your power and influence, your collective voice and wisdom to create change for women in Australia? And I remember the first conversation I had with one of the CEOs. He had twins, a boy and a girl. And I explained to him that here in Australia, women make up only 3% of the top 200 companies' CEOs. They make up only 17% of board positions of the top 200. And I explained to him that it didn't matter which sector he looked at, the basic rule was the same. And that is that the higher up you go, the less women you see. And that's despite living in a country where women represent 50.8% of the population, where 60% of university graduates are female. I told him that while women are excluded from economic, social and political power in this country, they will be marginalised everywhere. And while many of us have known the data for many decades, I think what shifted for him was the understanding that without the intervention of powerful, decent men, this story would become his daughter's story. That without the intervention of powerful and decent men, that his daughter would never have the same opportunities as his son. And whilst he'd understood it with his head, he started to engage with his heart. I mean, what dad doesn't want the same opportunities for their daughters as they do for their son? And as our male champions say, and one of our most outspoken says, he says, let's not pretend that there aren't already established norms that advantage men. The fact is, men invented the system, men run the system, men need to change the system. And that's what the Male Champions of Change strategy is all about. It's about men changing the system. The first time they came together 21 A-type personalities and me, many having travelled thousands of miles to attend. But I really saw there a deep commitment to take the difficult decisions that would lead to action. As one of them said, he said, "This issue is not beyond our intellectual capability to solve. Excuses are just that." And the first thing they did was they wrote to every business leader in Australia, making the case for change and urging them to get on board. And just last month, they held a public launch where they reported on 18 months of action in their organisations. And interestingly, in that room, there were more men than women. They weren't all fellow travellers. There were chairs of boards which had no women on them. There were CEOs of executive teams which had very few women. And the main message of the champions was that the change starts with us. And not only that, but they developed a model to help other leaders understand what needed to change. Their model includes 4 very simple things. They look to measure what I say, how I act, what I prioritise, and how I measure. And for many of them, in the honest conversations, they had to understand their leadership shadow. There were some groundbreaking moments. So they've gone on to do a number of really bold things now. For example, one of the organisations has announced that as from January 2014, every role in their organisation will be advertised and available in a flexible work arrangement. And that's an organisation of around 40,000 people. That changes the conversation. It changes the starting point. All the champions have signed on to the panel pledge. That means that before they accept invitations to speak at events, they want to know how many female speakers will be joining them at the conference or on the panel discussion. And they've worked out that they can use their collective buying power through their supplier diversity initiative or supplier multiplier initiative. Between them at the minute, they have $30 billion worth of spend annually, and they want to direct it to suppliers and partners who care about gender equality, just like them. Now, aside from being some of the busiest men in the country, in the last 12 months, they've spoken at over 100 events on women's leadership, not just here in Australia, but in the US, Brazil, and many other countries. Change will not happen, gender equality will not happen without men taking the message of gender equality to other men. Of that, I'm certain. We cannot allow the achievement of gender equality to sit solely on the shoulders of women. When men step up and take shared ownership with us, that's when we will stride forward together. The male champions of change will continue to drive change in the corporate world. The military cultural reforms are well underway. But the reality is, unless we change the informal social structures that sit around us, that exist in our family, none of this will matter. Are we prepared to push to one side the talent, the creativity, and capability of 50% of the world's population? That's what's at stake here. We have new beginnings. We have a path to a more equal future. But it starts with us. I'm often asked, Liz, what will be your greatest achievement as Australia's Sex Discrimination Commissioner? And it won't be the military. It won't be the male champions of change or parental leave. It will be raising a son who fundamentally believes that equality is the only path. Thank you.